Welcome back to the CEC office in Warsaw. We're here just a few days after a very exciting 13th of October 2019 parliamentary election in Poland that ensured a second lone majority government of the Law and Justice Party for the next 4 years. I'm here with Marek Matraszek, because who else?
You're very kind, Staszek.
To discuss all the results, both in the lower chamber and in the Senate. But first of all, Marek, Law and Justice, another lone majority, 235 seats with 231 required. Now, we knew for some time that the polls showed that Law and Justice will win re-election. But is this what Jarosław Kaczyński had in mind? Is this a big win?
Well, I think this is the very interesting debate that observers are having. Was it a big win or was it not a big win? Certainly on the one hand, if you look at the absolute voter numbers that turned out and voted for Law and Justice, it was over 8 million. That's well over 2 million more than they actually polled in 2015. They got the highest percentage vote, I think, of any party in Polish political history. And they have an absolute majority in Parliament under the HONT proportional representation system. It makes it very, very difficult to achieve an overall majority. But of course, for reasons which we'll come to discuss in a minute, the Law and Justice leadership is not entirely happy with the result, because the small number of votes that they have over an overall majority make governance very difficult in the long term, given some of the developing factionalism that you see emerging now within the party. There are other factors as well.
You mentioned the factionalism. Of course, we have the two coalition parties of Law and Justice, because it's a whole bloc, the United Right, composed of Law and Justice proper, and then the Agreement Party of Jarosław Gowin, Deputy Prime Minister, and Solidarity Poland of Justice Minister Zbigniew Ziobro. And these factions have increased their standing in Parliament. Now, what does this mean for the whole United Right bloc in general?
Well, I think there are two main developments coming out of it. You're right, they have increased their strength within the Parliament. Both of those factions have, I think, about 18 MPs each. That's almost 40 MPs altogether. So theoretically, they can go to Jarosław Kaczyński and actually ask for certain concessions in terms of ministerial positions and so on. And I think there's a little bit of that jockeying happening right now as we speak. But in the longer term, and I think particularly in the case of Mr. Gowin, he's going to try and leverage that influence within the party to try and affect a shift in some of the policies of Law and Justice over the last 4 years, which he actually thinks were the reason why perhaps the victory wasn't as big as it could have been. So I think this is going to have a short-term influence on the makeup of the next government. But I think longer term, there'll be a very interesting policy discussion within Law and Justice, which may actually lead to some policy changes going forward.
Speaking of the makeup of the new government, we're here on a Wednesday, 3 days after the election. Do we know the timeline of when the next government is going to be formed, and is the position of Mateusz Morawiecki stable?
Well, I think the timeline, it's actually, we do and we don't, because actually the clock starts ticking for the formation of the government the moment that the President Duda, announces is the first day of the sitting of the new parliament. That has to happen within 30 days of the election itself. And then there's a constitutional procedure. The current government actually is in situ until the first day of the first sitting of the new parliament. And after that, there will be probably a week or so before. So we'll probably be seeing the new government in place at the beginning of November, by the mid-November at the very latest.
And what of the Prime Minister?
Well, I think, as you say, it's Wednesday morning, so nothing's certain until it really happens. But I think today we're hearing that Chairman Kaczyński has actually said that Mr. Morawiecki will stay on as the Prime Minister. So I think that's pretty definite. And I think most of the other ministerial positions, I think, are pure speculation. There are some names being bandied about of ministers who may go. I certainly think the Foreign Minister will probably be changed. Perhaps the Energy Minister, and there may be one or two other changes. So it's very interesting to see how deep those changes go.
And perhaps new ministries, a new composition altogether in some sorts.
Well, again, there has been talk, because certainly that was before the election, that there would be an attempt to consolidate some of the ministries and actually recreate some old ministries as well. The Ministry of State Treasury, I think, has been mooted to return in order to take over management of many of the state-owned companies that we have in Poland. But again, until we see the makeup of the new government, it will be very difficult to predict.
And now that we covered the government, we have to move on to an equally exciting part, the opposition. especially the Civic Coalition, but also the Senate, where the opposition has managed to secure a one-seat majority. What does that mean?
Well, I think it is a very much a mixed bag for the Civic Coalition. I think the consensus is that really they've reached almost a glass ceiling. They had 4 years to prepare for this election. And we know they had a very vigorous messaging over the last 4 years about rule of law issues, media freedoms, threat to democracy, relationships with Europe. That was being very clearly communicated to the Polish people. And yet they only got 27% of the vote. And obviously fewer MPs, I think, this time than they had in the last parliament. So that's not good for Mr. Schetyna. Well, certainly in the Senate, what you have is, again, a very interesting situation, because although certainly Law and Justice have lost control of the Senate, they have, I think it's 48 seats, actually Civic Coalition, the Civic Platform, have less seats than that, and the remainder is made up of the PSL party and several independents. And I think that's going to be very interesting. The first real test will come in the next few days as to whether or not the Civic Coalition candidate for the Speaker of the Senate, Bogdan Borusewicz, will in fact be elected or not. And that will be a real test of the influence of Grzegorz Schetyna, because that's his candidate, and there is some resistance to that within the PSL. We'll see what happens.
And there's already comments that the new Speaker of the Senate is going to be the most important politician on the opposition for the next 4 years. Is that likely? Is that true?
Well, constitutionally, of course, the Speaker of the Senate is the third person in the hierarchy of the constitutional order. And he has certain rights. He can, on demand, he can make speeches to the nation over television. He'll be a very high-profile personality. And I think in the face of a lower house, which remains under Law and Justice control, that Speaker will be, I think, the intention of the opposition will certainly be to turn him into a national figure. So that'll be a very interesting battle for who that figurehead actually is, because again, as you say, he will have a very strong voice in public debate going forward over the next 4 years.
So the opposition has potentially returned to the Senate, but there is also another return, the return of the left. After 4 years of an absence, the Democratic Left Alliance, the SLD, is making a return with 2 additional parties which it ran with. So the Spring of Robert Biedroń and the Together Party ran under the informal influence of Adrian Zandberg, are making a quite strong return. And commentators are already saying that they have the most potential for action as an opposition party.
I certainly think so. I mean, there were expectations that actually they would get even more votes. I think 15% was the expectation. But nonetheless, as you say, it's a return from 4 years in the wilderness back into politics. And I think what they have going for them is freshness. I mean, apart from 1 or 2 old-timers, as it were, from the SLD who've made it back into Parliament, certainly the Wiosna faction and the Adrian Zandberg's party are predominantly young, vigorous, and they certainly they feel the wind of change is behind them. And their real challenge will be, and I think this is their goal, is over the next 4 years to see if it's possible to try and supplant the Civic Platform as the main opposition party going into the 2023 elections by pushing forward a very vigorous left-wing message. I think will be a combination of social liberalism on the one hand and a certain acceptance of economic redistribution, which has been the hallmark, and which has been pretty much the hallmark of Law and Justice over the last 4 years. So trying to combine those 2 policy strands and trying to be more credible as an alternative to peace than the Civic Platform has been.
And the second party that is being dubbed as the biggest winner on the opposition is the agrarian PSL, making a little bit of a stronger return, but also ensuring the survival of a couple MPs from the Cookies 15 movement, which had about 40 MPs 4 years ago, now down to around 4 or 6. Is the PSL likely to actually have an active role in politics?
I think it's a very interesting future ahead of the PSL, because they've managed several things. One of they've increased their vote. They've actually increased their percentage above what I think they expected. But they've actually managed to do something which not many people thought was possible, which actually start getting MPs elected in urban areas. For example, Władysław Bartoszewski in Warsaw, who's a very strong candidate indeed. And actually, they've also made an appeal to entrepreneurs. I think particularly at the end of the campaign, they actually picked up votes from entrepreneurs worried about some of the more socialist policies that Law and Justice were suggesting. And finally, what they have going for them, particularly in a very polarised political system, is moderation. And I think there is a group in the electorate that actually, to whom that sort of slightly stoic, calm approach of their leader, of the PSL leader, Mr. Kosiniak-Kamysz, appeals to. And buttressing that right at the bottom is the sort of an appeal to sort of a Christian democratic political tradition. So I think there's an electorate there, and I think they're going to build up on it over the next few years as well.
I'm smiling about moderation and stoicism because last but not least, we have the Maverick Confederation party, which broke the monopoly on the right from Law and Justice with 11 MPs. I think this was the problem for most pollsters and analysts, is that nobody expected the Confederation to get in. And that's what skewed the electoral calculus a little bit for us in the first couple of days.
Well, because of their radicalism, and they are very radical, they are very far right, I think a lot of voters are actually sort of embarrassed to admit to pollsters that they were going to be voting for them. That's why they were not picked up by the polling. They've got over 1 million, I think over 1,200,000 votes. It's a very significant vote indeed. And actually, if you look at the demographics of the vote, it's very interesting, because if you look at the 18 to 29 year age group of electors as a whole, Confederation picked up, I think, almost 20% in that age group. So they have a very strong appeal to young voters as well. What will be interesting, of course, is they're very fractious internally. There are some very strong personalities there. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, the radical libertarian, who's also very pro-Russian, pro-Putin. And there's other figures on the more nationalist right as well. There are some doubts as to how far they will be able to hold together in the new parliament. But I think what is important about the Confederation that reveals that there is a very potentially growing electorate to whom a far-right message does have an appeal. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, not just for Law and Justice, but for all the other democratic parties in parliament, of how they deal with that. But it's certainly something to watch.
And you have been following the elections in Poland for the past 30 years. How would you sum up this and the future of political stability in Poland, perhaps?
Well, I think I think we're coming to the cusp of a certain epoch in Polish politics. This is probably the last election where you've had a substantial number of politicians running who have been active in politics since 1989. So you certainly have a generational turnover. And I think everyone is expecting the 2023 election to be very interesting, because there's a lot of doubt whether Law and Justice will be able to secure another majority in 4 years' time. And that opens up the prospect of a return to coalition politics, which we haven't had for some time. But I think after 2023, we'll be back to more, certainly coalition politics, but by the same virtue, a more unstable politics as well. So I think that's a long time in the future, though. We still have another 4 years of single party rule, but what happens after that is really anybody's guess.
Well, thank you very much, and I think I'll see you when we have a new Prime Minister.
Whatever that will be, so I certainly hope so. Thank you very much.
Thanks.